Welcome to the Zodiac Files, episode 19 of the interview series. And today we're be covering a topic that I've been talking about getting to for a long time now, and I finally finished reading the books. So we're going to be covering the Zodiac Revisited by Michael F. Cole. Get volume 1, 2, and 3 out now on Amazon. Also check out Mike's website, zodiacrevisited.com. And you can find the links to that in the description, as well as to Mike's channel. So if you guys are familiar with my non-canonical video series, the Zodiac Files, Mike actually goes into depth of a lot of that stuff. The Swindle seaside slayings, the Gaviota Beach murders of Domingos Edwards, and even quite a bit more than that. So without further ado, making his debut on the channel is author Michael Cole. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, Ross. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm pumped to be back on the saddle and getting the show going once again. It's been a while. So Mike and I were talking off air, and I just have pretty much random questions from his 3 volumes of his books. So as we said, definitely go check those out on Amazon, pick them up, drop him some reviews, and we're kind of going to be jumping off. Anything else that you wanted us to lead off with, Mike, or do you want to get right into the questions?
No, let's go. Let's get into it.
Let's do it. So I was telling Mike, right now I'm reading Shooting Zodiac by Robert Graysmith. You guys know how I feel about Graysmith. I've spoke on it many times, but I'm actually quite enjoying this. I'm only a few chapters in. And obviously when Fincher and Graysmith's in the room and the writers have their first encounter with Toschi, obviously Paul Stine comes up, and this has been speculated endlessly on the internet. I know you've seen this stuff, Mike, and you raised the question in your book. I was just wondering, as far as Zodiac seated in the front or the back seat, do you have any kind of like perspective on that? Anything else you want to jump in on Paul Stine?
Honestly, I don't really have a perspective on whether he was seated in the front or the back. I've always assumed he was seated in the back, but you know, there's really not a whole lot of, or there's no proof either way. So, and honestly, I don't think it really matters too much. There's, there's a lot of details in this case, and some of them matter and some of them not so much. I've always kind of classified that question as one of these details that we know it's unknowable, we don't know, and likely doesn't matter too much. Of course, I'd be more than fine with being proven wrong on that if somebody can prove that it is, one way or the other and it's meaningful in some way. But as far as I can tell, it really isn't, and I don't know the answer to that.
Sure, no, I tend to agree with that. I mean, so I'll just raise, going off of the last thing I saw, which I just mentioned, I'm reading Shooting Zodiac. So Fincher did say to Toschi in chapter 3 that Zodiac's sitting in the back. Based on what Graysmith wrote there, Toschi doesn't correct him in that moment. We obviously have all seen the movie. We know Fincher has Zodiac sitting in the back. So I tend to agree. I mean, maybe like blood splatter wise, like maybe it would send it one direction or the other. I'm no forensic expert. I've watched a little bit of Dexter like the rest of us have. So maybe that would have some effect. I think the correct answer is it seems like he's sitting in the back for the shot. And then obviously we know he goes and sits in the passenger seat to try to tear off the shirt. The other thing is kind of like in this back and forth with Toschi and Fincher early on in Shooting Zodiac. Fincher asked Toschi if the shirt is torn, and Toschi tells him it was torn. I'm just kind of wondering, like, how they would even know that other than, like, a very precise cut from scissors or a knife. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I remember Tom Voigt pointing out that it was specifically torn many, many years ago. But I think likely they're inferring that just from the rip in the cloth, as opposed to being precisely cut like you're mentioning with the scissors or knife or something. But yeah, I don't know anything beyond that.
Yeah, 100%. I'm in the same boat as you. I don't pray again. Just going off the last thing I read, and Fincher keeps doubling down. He keeps saying like, "Oh man, to rip that shirt, he'd have to be a big, strong, powerful man," and this and that. It's just like, as you said, it's a lot of speculation. Shout out to Pixie. She's got your website or links there. Just get that up for everybody. But yeah, I mean,
you never know. He might have started it with like a cut and then ripped it from who knows, right?
See, that's what I was thinking, and I think Fincher mentioned that as well.
Yeah.
But again, it's like with your witnesses being, 20 feet up, 50 feet away, it's like obviously they're not going to see those exact details. I recall, if anybody remembers in the chat, you want to correct me, that I thought one of the witnesses did say they thought they saw like a glint of either a knife or a scissors. I can't exactly recall where I saw that, so that may not be accurate. But that's kind of what always sent me down that path. Like it would make a lot more sense for speed wise, just like you said, to have the cut and then just kind of rip it from there. They were also talking about, at least Fincher kept on saying this, that they thought that like he dipped the shirt in the blood to obviously relate it to the fact when he was going to send the correspondent that like this is obviously Paul Stine's shirt. It's interesting, but I don't know how they would be able to differentiate that from it was just already wet from the blood already,
Right.
And I'm just kind of giving you random speculation here.
I always kind of assumed that he had sort of wiped it in blood. I mean, it was, the bottom of the back of the shirt.
Sure.
So, but of course, I don't, again, it's one of those things that I kind of assume one way, but really don't know. Like so much of the case.
100%. Yeah. It's like, and I think that's almost exactly what, and again, this is kind of like secondhand. I think they did have a tape recorder in the room, but Graysmith didn't really, at least where I'm at, say whether everything that he wrote here was transcribed exactly from what they recorded, because what he said in the book was Fincher's tape recorder. But I liked the dipping it in the blood because that was the first I had ever heard of that, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, if it was the exact same shirt and they did what they did later on, which you and I know is they took it out and then they fit the swatch on, I mean, I think it would have just fit anyway, right? You wouldn't really need the blood in there, but of course,
right.
Zodiac,
but I think there's some shock value of having these swatches have blood on them.
I agree.
Certainly.
100%. I agree. Yeah. Anything else on Presidio Heights, Paul Stine, or do you want to keep it moving?
Well, there's, I suppose a couple things, there's the huge debate about Falk and Zelms and whether they had actually seen the Zodiac, whether they actually talked to him. I know there's been a lot of contentious debates over the years about it. And in fact, I've been involved with some of those contentious debates over the years.
Myself as well.
But I always thought that it's my personal opinion that they did, in fact, talk to the Zodiac. And I always thought that Zelms, likely Falk was driving, Zelms was in the passenger seat, and that essentially Zelms had talked to him. And that, he had given them some kind of bullshit story, and then they sped off. But that's certainly one of the more interesting aspects of the case, what actually happened there. The other thing that, please go ahead.
Oh, I mean, just agreeing. I mean, I could totally see that version. I mean, I would push back a little bit on that one just because it's gotten so convoluted over time. I always kind of just go off what Falcon, when Rodelli and his partner interviewed Falk, he said that they didn't talk to him at all. This is like early 2000s or whatever, right? So way after the fact. And he said that Zelms literally didn't see him at all, didn't see the guy at all. That always struck me as a little strange because you're coming from a murder scene. You're looking for any person you see at all. Only one guy walks by, and the passenger guy, unless he's completely looking on the other side of the street, and you're both like, hey, you take that side, I'll take that side. So I don't know. I can see where you're going because the Zelms never saw him at all story always struck me as a little bit like there's only one guy walking down the street. How do both people in the car not see him? You know what I
Yeah, and Falk's story has changed over the years.
That's true.
I tend to believe more of his Crimes of the Century story. If you listen to that interview,
Sure.
but even then I believe I don't know what the situation is there, why he's doing what he's doing. I personally believe he's lying, and that's why the story's changed over the years. I don't know what his motivation would be. I don't know why he wouldn't be able to just sort of admit to it. But yeah, certainly an area where different people have different opinions, and that's all good. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. No, yeah, and it's just hard to know. I mean, I know people are super hard on him because the scratch report doesn't come in for like 30 days or whatever. I think it's my
Well,
understanding
it's dated the day that the Zodiac's letter is published,
yeah.
saying that he ran into somebody. So, I mean, that's really telling, in my opinion.
Yeah, I can totally see that. I mean, I think, was it Phelps? I think one of his parents passed away around that time. So, I think the guy did have a lot going on. So I try not to be too hard on him. I mean, yeah, I think the way you laid it out in the volumes was, yeah, of course the newspaper article is going to prime his memory, right? And then rushes back and writes a scratch report. It's like, that didn't help.
That's a very kind way of putting it.
Sure.
The other thing I would say about the Stine murder is that people try to theorize about where the Zodiac lived. And to be honest, I feel like we have very little evidence to tell us where he lived.
I agree.
Other than in the San Francisco Bay Area somewhere. But I do think there are two sort of pieces of evidence, or maybe it's more than two sort of sets of evidence to suggest where he did not live.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those, I know this is a minority opinion, but my opinion is he did not live in Vallejo. But the other suggestion is he did not live in the Presidio Heights area. And the reason that I believe this is true is because if you look at the evidence around the crime, it's pretty clear that he planned the crime around the intersection of Washington and Maple.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where he told Paul Stine to go. We all know that he went one block farther at that point, ended up at Washington and Cheri. But when he writes the Paul Stine letter, he says over by Washington and Maple. Now, certainly there's other possible interpretations, but to me, what that means is that he planned it around Washington and Maple, and he didn't know the name of the street that was one street past Maple. And rather than go look it up on a map, he just wrote over by Washington and Maple. So, again, I know there are people that think that he lived in that area and people that think that he lived in Vallejo, but for that reason, I don't think he lived in the Presidio Heights area.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think he lived in the Presidio Heights area, and I don't think he would do his last canonical close to where he lived, even remotely close, because even though I know you did a really good job of covering the pacing between the canonicals, but for it to be only 2 weeks after Lake Berryessa for him feeling that pressure or whatever reason wanting to move up his schedule,
Right.
I don't think he takes that risk to try to do the fight, especially downtown SFPD. You're going to have like Toschi and Armstrong all over you. Obviously, what he wanted SFPD's attention, but I don't think he wanted it that closely. But it seems sloppy work for a map guy not to just look up a map, as you said, a la the Mount Diablo compass and the Rose compass and his apparent fascination with maps. It should have been quite easy for him to just look up that. But again, that could have just been a thing of like, I'm just going to keep referring to it as Maple. Zodiac does these little nuances where I'm not going to give too much. The only other thing I would add on Presidio Heights is his lengthy story of I was hiding in the bushes while the motorcycles and the cars and the parade went by, the barking dogs and such. I really don't think it just sounds like Zodiac is just kind of making that up. It seems like isn't there a report of someone saw someone running into the Presidio Park? So if you're sprinting through the park, I don't think you just stop to hide in some bushes. That's just my take on it. I mean, you know, Radetich is totally opposite for me on this.
So I honestly think he was there. Exactly how long, I don't know. But, you know, as I mentioned in the book, I talked with Charlie Bean, and he is the one that led the dog search that night. And interestingly, as I describe in the book, they showed up a little bit, or I mean, didn't describe all of it in the book, but you know, they showed up a little bit late, like 45 minutes after sort of everybody had arrived. They, you know, they had 6 dogs. The dogs were trained to find people in areas. He specifically explained this. There's, you know, there's different dog teams and different tactics and different police departments, but their dogs were trained to find people in areas where there should be no people. So the typical scenario is they would have a suspect that is believed to be in a particular building. So they clean out the building. And at that point, there should be no people in that area. And then they send the dogs in to go find if anybody's in the building. So, you know, they showed up a little bit late. He explained that a lot of his other handlers were like, hey, what are we doing? This guy's not here. There's no chance he's still here. What's the point? And, you know, Charlie led that group. So he basically said, you know, this is our job. This is what we do. We're going to give them the best search we can give them. And but the interesting thing to me is that, you know, as I think I've described in the book, they sectioned the area off into thirds. And the middle third was the area that they felt the suspect, the Zodiac, was most likely to be. And so that's the section that the dogs searched. And then the other third, one of them was searched by the SFPD, and the other one was searched by a platoon from the Presidio. Yep. So, you know, that description of there being a virtual boundary where the dogs essentially would stop searching at, and yet he could have been beyond that, is very consistent with what he describes. You know, he says the dogs never got within 2 blocks of me. And first of all, saying 2 blocks is, you know, again, as I mentioned in the book, is a very odd thing to be describing sort of this scenario, in my opinion. But if you are, you know, looking at a map and thinking about where things are and the city blocks are very evident on the map, then maybe it's not such an odd thing, odd kind of terminology to be using. But because of that, I've always felt that his description is likely based in truth. That, you know, with the Zodiac, he's always able to sort of spin things and lie about things and modify things. But you know, I think that he really was in that area. How long he stayed, when he left, I don't know. But I think he really was there.
Sure. No, that part of the book was excellent with the interview with Charlie and the way you broke down the search. But that's probably the most detail I've seen of that Presidio Heights park broken down. So definitely everybody go check out the book. But yeah, that was a fantastic part. I think you by far went into the most detail on that. And the way you laid it out makes a lot of sense. And also his use of 2 blocks, it's almost like a metaphor because, you know, like you said, from Maple to Cheri, like to the Presidio is like 2 blocks. So it's like that could have been on his mind from, you know, 2 blocks into the park is kind of saying what happened 2 blocks outside there is like where I shot Stine. So you can see that is on his mind.
Interesting thought.
Yeah, just that's my speculation. But again, that could be way off. I wanted to go moving away from Stine to Presidio Heights. This was a little kind of note that you had in there that I thought was fascinating. the call to Oakland PD before the Dunbar incident, and basically reports of like that voice didn't match the voice on the show, which was obviously, you know, Eric, the mental hospital guy. I hadn't really heard much about that before, and it's, I don't want to put words in your mouth. It seemed like the way you insinuated it was like that could have been Zodiac, or you thought maybe that call may have been the Zodiac.
It absolutely could have been. And that whole scenario is a little bit weird because the San Francisco Examiner article essentially has a quote from, I think it was a direct quote, or it might have been paraphrasing, explaining that, yes, somebody had called, that they had some knowledge of previous crimes that had convinced them that it was legitimate. That could mean anything almost. But and then the Chronicle had an article basically saying that Oakland said it wasn't the Zodiac that had called. So it's, you know, I'm not really sure what's going on there, to be honest, but it you know, especially given sort of the Zodiac's apparent respect for F. Lee, or sorry, who's the lawyer? Not F. Lee Bailey.
Melvin Belli.
Melvin Belli, yeah. His respect for Melvin Belli, you know, that certainly seems like a possibility. And you know, a lot of the reporting back then, they did make mistakes. So it's sometimes hard to tell with things when they're reported one way or reported another way. But yeah, I always thought that was odd that we sort of had the Examiner saying one thing and the Chronicle saying a different thing.
Yeah, absolutely. You do a great job of the discrepancies between the Examiner and the Chronicle in the book. I thought there was one comment about the person who actually took the call. I don't know if that was a switchboard or whatever, and I'll probably butcher it now because I just jammed all three books into my brain, but that it was like a monotone voice or something. So I thought that, you know, maybe that could fit with what we know of, you know, the Slover call, you know, Napa, and, you know, the other Zodiac calls that we have. I was just interested. I was like, hey, did we have another Zodiac phone call here? Because that's what it sounded like. I know there's like a radio show in Texas, and I know that there's like a lot more Zodiac phone calls that don't really, you know, lead anywhere. But that one sounded promising because before the TV show and all that and the whole Belli thing, like you said.
Right.
I'll keep us moving here. And I know Mike said we might have some discrepancies on some things. So anything that you think I was off on, Mike, feel free to press me on. Believe me, the audience would love me to lose a Zodiac debate. They don't call me here, but we'll go to one that we're probably at odds on. Even though your depiction of it was amazing in the books, not downtrodding anything that Mike wrote, but the Kathleen Johns incident, it's just one of the more inflammatory in the Zodiac community. And of course, we have the recent announcement that they did identify her skull remains, which was, you know, 20 years later, 25 years later, or whatever.
Kathleen Johns or Donna Lass?
Whoops! I just conflated the two. So I said we'll get to Donna Lass later. Let's just do Kathleen Johns for now. I conflated them. That was my bad.
Yeah, honestly, I'm a little surprised that more people don't accept Kathleen Johns as a legitimate victim of the Zodiac. There's a lot to it. You know, Howard Davis and somebody Smith interviewed Kathleen Johns way back in 1999 or thereabouts. That interview is very interesting, and you know, anybody that's really interested in sort of understanding Kathleen Johns' ordeal, incident, whatever you want to call it,
Sure.
I would suggest that you listen to that. She's very compelling in her descriptions of things, and you know, of course, as I describe in volume 2 of my books, I personally believe that the killer was motivated by the solstices and the equinoxes. So trying to coordinate timing of some aspects of his activity to align with the solstices and the equinoxes. Now, I know a lot of people don't really believe this or, give much credence to it. But the fact of the matter is, and, again, as I describe in volume 2, the zodiac and what it is, which is the division of the nighttime sky into 12 30 degrees slices, each of which have a constellation in them. That was, devised like around 2,000 years ago. And when it was created, it was specifically aligned with the solstices and the equinoxes. So the solstices and the equinoxes are a definitional part of the zodiac. So, anytime that you talk about the zodiac, you are indirectly talking about solstices and equinoxes. Now, for my money, understanding the timing of the attacks and the letters and whatnot, the killer understood this. This is part of the reason he called himself the Zodiac, and part of the reason that, in my opinion, he constructed this methodology that involved the solstices and the equinoxes. And of course, one of the things that supports Kathleen Johns is that it was very, very close to the spring equinox of 1970, I guess. So that's certainly one thing. It's not the only thing, and again, as I describe elsewhere, there is a very clear element of what I describe as a particular tactic, which is intentional sabotage, or in this case, intentional automotive sabotage, followed by a Good Samaritan ruse. And, we see that with Cheri Jo Bates, and we see it with Kathleen Johns. Now, they are slightly different in that, with Cheri Jo Bates, the car was sabotaged while she wasn't around. It was easier to do. It was a Volkswagen Beetle, and almost certain, well, I'm sure her, the hatch for the engine, on the Beetles, the engines are in the back. The hatch for the engine could easily have been opened and could have easily messed with it. Obviously, with Kathleen Johns, he had to essentially convince her to pull over in order to sabotage her car. So in some sense, that's different, admittedly. But again, as I mentioned in the book, the idea that, especially at that time, that a woman having car trouble would be receptive to help from a stranger is a very powerful thing back then. And I think the killer understood this and understood that it was so powerful that he was willing to create the scenario where he had to get her to pull over to intentionally sabotage the car. I really think what happened there, Kathleen was 7 months pregnant. She had her daughter with her. Again, from that interview that Howard Davis did, Kathleen described she had the station wagon, and she put the seats back in the back down so that her daughter, Jennifer, could sleep back there. This is 1970s. Not the safest thing in the world to do, but certainly was very common back then. So, my belief is that the killer was likely somewhere around Modesto. She had stopped to get gas. She was getting back onto Highway 1 or getting onto Highway 132. Somewhere he was likely sitting somewhere looking for lone females going in that direction. getting on to 132. And in that scenario, he wouldn't have seen Jennifer. He would have just seen a lone female, and that would have precisely fit his victim profile. And so, he doesn't understand that she has a daughter until after the car has been sabotaged. And that's why I believe personally he's driving around not knowing what to do. And again, as is documented in that interview, if you look at what Graysmith describes regarding their conversation, Graysmith says the killer says to Kathleen Johns, "I'm going to throw the baby out the window." But what the killer actually says to her is, "Throw that baby out the window." So the killer wants Kathleen to throw the baby out the window. Of course, that's not going to happen. I mean, there's no way. But, that really, in my opinion, gives insight into what's going on in the killer's head. The killer has this plan. This baby is in the way. This baby is the problem. He wants this problem to go away. If he can get rid of the baby, then he can proceed with, what he was ready and able to do, which was essentially murder Kathleen Johns. But, of course, that didn't happen. And he drives around so long that eventually Kathleen sees her chance to get away and takes it. So, it's certainly a very interesting scenario and set of events. And because of the whole sabotage thing, I feel like the more strongly you believe in Cheri Jo Bates, the more strongly you should believe in Kathleen Johns, and vice versa. I believe in both of those crimes in terms of being attributed to the Zodiac.
Yeah, no, the way you laid out the modus operandi comparison, in the book was an extremely strong argument, and just the whole detail you went into. I always thought that it just got played up because of the Graysmith chapter, and then of course Fincher includes the scene in the movie. I don't flat out think like Kathleen Johns is like lying, or the whole burner car for the insurance money scam. I believe it was Davis who corrected that she didn't even have car insurance, but she used to hotwire her car to start it. And may I say that the whole solstice theory in your book, I think, is one of the best, ideas that you presented in the book. And that's kind of what moved my dial on Radetich a little bit. And yeah, I mean, you kind of did move me up on Johns. It's just, I don't know that for me, that her going back to the station and seeing the composite and like, that's the man I saw when she only saw his profile is like strong enough for me. Like I would need a little bit more than that. Going to your Quadrant theory, him going back to the car and burning it by fire, that makes it a little bit more Zodiac for me because of course, slaves in paradise. But yeah, I mean, there's just a lot.
Interestingly, I don't think that is it was intended to be the fire quadrant, as you probably know if you've read the rest of my books. But it is interesting that he did go back and burn the car. Absolutely. But, she did ride around with him for 2 hours or so, or whatever it was. So, yeah. And when that's another interesting part of the interview that Howard did with her. She said that in terms of a match to the composite, that it was clear as day. So, it absolutely, in her mind, was that person, right? And, I think with the police reports and whatnot, and the discrepancies with to other descriptions, from reading the newspaper articles and the police reports, it's clear that, the newspaper articles were basically written from the police reports, and or possibly maybe, some equivalent input, because there's really not much difference there. So I don't really feel like any alignment between those two is that interesting. But the way she described it is, right, she went to the police station and she talked to them, and as she's talking to them, she sees the composite after a while, 10, 15 minutes, whatever it was. So she tells part of the story. And then once she identifies him as the Zodiac, she explains that they stopped taking her report at that point. And they took her and her baby and put her in this diner and left her there all night. And, she explains how they didn't, the lights were off. She didn't even turn them on. She just sat there in the dark all night. And then, later the next day, they come and get her and take her, I think, over to the sheriff's office. And she says they, re-interviewed her or whatever. But there's also it seems like some amount of hostility between her and the cops. So, and I know a fair number of people, if they, the police took you and put you in a diner all night with an infant kid, would not be very happy, but in the morning. So,
absolutely.
I really don't think there's too much surprise that things might have developed in the way that they did. And the other thing with all that I never quite understood, there's always reference to the what is it, the Modesto B article about the killing, but or no, I'm sorry, about the incident. But there was almost an equivalent Sacramento or San Francisco Examiner article that had a lot of essentially the same information. So if you wanted to make the case that the killer read about it, he didn't need to read that B article. He could have read the Examiner article. But again, I think all of that is kind of irrelevant because I think he actually did it.
Sure. No, I mean, I think you nailed the whole thing of, her being stuck all night and, having hardly eaten. I could totally understand the friction, between them, as you were saying. There was a time where I was probably like 75% on Cheri Jo Bates being Zodiac, and I've lowered a bit, but I'm still open to Kathleen Johns. I just wanted a little bit. I'm bigger on the taking credit theory than you are. I know, like, you push back on it in the books. I just wanted a little bit more from him than I gave a woman and her baby a rather interesting ride. Whereas we know Zodiac's a car guy. On all these other ones, he's full of all these details. I just would have liked a little bit more from him.
But he's not full of all those details at that point in time. He kind of goes through a progression, right? In the beginning, he's really got this identity establishment phase where he wants the police to understand I'm the killer, and in that phase, he provides all kinds of detail. But once he gets past that phase, and really kind of starting with once he has the swatches from Paul Stine's shirt, he moves into the more of a create uncertainty phase.
Sure.
And in fact, one of my chapters is called Creating Uncertainty, because, this whole fear, uncertainty, and doubt kind of thing. He wants, in my opinion, after he's established, he wants to create sort of a boogeyman persona for himself. And, the kind of situation where when anything sort of bad or evil happens, people say, was that the Zodiac? And to some extent that happens. Somewhere in the books I documented, there's a lot of articles in the San Francisco Chronicle that are suggesting possible linkage to the Zodiac for crimes that eventually are shown to not have anything to do with the Zodiac, or very unlikely to have been related to the Zodiac. And in my opinion, that's exactly what he wants. That's why, that's why he's changing his weapon for every crime. Because, I'm trying to think here. The Son of Sam killer, David Berkowitz, he went and bought, I forget what caliber weapon
44.
it was.
44 caliber.
Was it 44? Yeah. So there's a lot of parallels between David Berkowitz and Son of Sam. And I had a section of the book that my editor eventually suggested that I remove, and I followed her advice. But it was kind of comparing the Zodiac with other serial killers. And in my mind, the Zodiac is kind of a amalgam of David Berkowitz and the Unabomber, really. in terms of psychology and what he's doing and whatnot. But the point is, with David Berkowitz, he was a much simpler version. He felt wronged by all the women of the world, and he went, I think, down to Texas, bought the gun, came back, and started shooting people. But the point is, he used the same weapon. So not only could you connect the crimes that he committed, but you could essentially rule out crimes that he didn't commit by virtue of it not matching his gun.
Sure.
Zodiac didn't want that latter part. You know, he's changing his weapons so that every time there's some kind of crime, people could reasonably suspect that he was responsible, because that's what he does, right? He changes his weapon.
Sure.
So, yeah.
I mean, along that pattern, in my opinion, in your opinion, he was already doing that in the non-canonical crimes before the Zodiac persona.
Yeah,
it's a different weapon in those as well, despite.
And to be honest, I think he was responsible for Gaviota, Santa Barbara, of course, and then the Swindles. Now, why he changed the weapon between Gaviota and the Swindles, I don't know. It might not have been for this reason, right? It might have been for some other practical reason. But by the time he was done with the Swindle ordeal, he would have come away understanding that the reason they could not connect the crimes was because he used a different weapon. So I think from that point forward, for any additional criminal activity he was going to do, he was likely going to change his weapon.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, like you said, ballistics. So I brought it up earlier, but I confused myself. Let's go on to Donna Lass. I asked you off air. You did a good job with relating this one in the book to the Quadrant theory. Apparently they had her skull since the mid '80s and decided not to tell us until much recently. I know you said that it didn't really move your needle one way or the other, but you kind of thought that was the right location where they announced.
Yeah, I've always kind of assumed that Donna Lass was legitimately a Zodiac victim. It is the case that sort of has the least amount of compelling evidence, and it is also misaligned. It's not. If it were to be aligned with something in terms of solstices and equinoxes, it would be the fall equinox, and which is about September 23rd or so. And it's interesting, but ultimately I think it's a coincidence that there is an article about Donna Lass in the Chronicle almost right on the equinox, the fall equinox, because that's a number of weeks after she actually disappeared. But as tempting as it would be to say, oh yeah, I'm sure he planned that to have it work out such that it was, there was an article in San Francisco about it. No, I don't think that's true. I go into volume 3, I speculate as to what might have been going on and why he might have chosen to sort of act a little bit early, which is essentially because Lake Tahoe is sort of farthest away from San Francisco, and it's very close to this time of year, right? It was right around Labor Day weekend, so it is sort of the one crime or I wish there was more evidence. Let's just say that. Sure. Certainly, there's not a whole lot of evidence here. But we do see the peek through the pines card. I forget. I believe is very well aligned, and I guess that's about all I can say on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm in the same. So I'm like, I've always leaned more towards taking credit theory on this one because the peek through the pines card just it doesn't do that much, for me in terms of detail. But again, it's some very interesting aspects to it. Like Donna Lass was a nurse at the Presidio Heights hospital, right? So like once you start finding more about her back, seems to start. Oops, I think we both dropped. May get you, but we've had a couple of pickups for the show lately here. I was just saying that due to her whole background being from San Francisco, it does seem to become a lot more interesting. You mentioned in the book her sister has sent this letter, the Guardian of the Pines letter or whatever. You have a whole chapter where you break down like would be Zodiac before he has that moniker, and then later on Zodiac persona, kind of writing these letters to family members and taunting them, which I thought you did an excellent job on. But Donna's just so tough. Like I'm 50-50, but I mean I think you did a really good job laying out the narrative.
Yeah, that's I think that card again is legitimate. Howard Davis, had images of the card, and he talked to the sister, and you go back and read the articles. It's really kind of compelling because the mom basically says we knew she was murdered because she would, there's nothing that would have stopped her from getting in touch with us. And that's in such stark contrast to typical reactions where people just hold out hope that their son or daughter is still alive somehow, somewhere. Yeah. But I think that's, very much indicative of what was going on and the type of person that Donna Lass was and all this kind of stuff. But again, as was the practice back then, they would essentially give out the addresses of the people that were involved. Yep. And when they interviewed the sister and the mother, they didn't give out their full address, but they told where they what city they lived in and what state. And with that information, you can very easily go get the addresses associated with them. So, assuming they were listed, but of course, I'm sure they were. So, yeah, that whole post-offense I call that survivor taunting. And it is something that we see with Donna Lass. We also see it with Kathleen Johns, or if you believe her, and I believe her, in that she said she received a Halloween card, not unlike the Halloween card that was sent to Paul Avery, except that it didn't have the additional decoration added to it. It was just a straight card. Yeah. And she said she was very explicit about what it said, which was it said to the woman in the station wagon. And the fact that it was a station wagon that she drove wasn't published anywhere. So sure. I know a lot of people probably just discount her and say, oh, that never happened or whatever, but she's very compelling when you listen to her. And I, for one, believe her. And then, of course, we also see with Cheri Jo Bates in terms of, again, if you believe that the 6-month anniversary notes, the 3 6-month anniversary notes are real, then you certainly see survivor tormenting in terms of the note that's sent to her father. So you take all these three together, and if you believe that they're related, you get this sense that this killer has this, he has this perverse psychological gratification that he gets out of tormenting the people who are closest to the people he's murdered or tried to murder. Or in the case of, Kathleen Johns, the person herself.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought you absolutely nailed that topic. And may I just say that drove me absolutely insane that Kathleen had that other Halloween card. She said she mailed it to Avery, and he never got it or he lost it or whatever.
Yeah, you know, that
like,
is one of the biggest you know, unexplained mysteries in this mystery, right? What was that real? I believe it was. And what happened to it? And why haven't others talked about it, I guess.
Yeah, that was just one of those missing puzzle pieces that just like really boiled me. And that, oh man, that was just so, it's like if we could have two of those cards, you know, what else could we have learned from that? But as you said, it's just one of those things that's really get lost to time in the incident. And again, I've always said I thought something happened to Kathleen Johns. I don't think it wouldn't make any sense to just flat out lie to make up all that story that has all these kind of random details. What, just to get your reaction, what did you make of the abductor, we'll say, going back and burning the car? Was that just to like get rid of evidence? Because it seems like if he was touching the tires and the lug nuts, is a fire really going to burn the hubcaps? You know what I mean?
You know, I suspect that sort of as I described in volume 3, that incident falling through was kind of a big deal because he had been planning to do this, in my opinion, been planning to do this on the equinox. And because she gets abducted and she goes to the police and files a report, I mean, all that hasn't happened yet, but it's pretty certain that it will. He can't go on with his plans anymore, right? He in my estimation, he does a lot of premeditation. So he, you know, this whole crime is premeditated around this area using this particular MO and this particular ruse and all this kind of stuff. So once the whole Kathleen Johns incident ends, he's, you know, that's it. Unless he wants to go somewhere else and do something else, but he's not going to do that at that point because he's not impulsive like that, in my opinion. So I would imagine that his frustration level is very high. And I think that, yeah, it's related to that. He wanted to do something, say something, and the best he could do at that point was go back to the car and burn it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I say we move on, go to one of my favorite subjects, the Gaviota Beach murders of Domingos and Edwards. I think you did one of the best jobs describing it that I've seen, although there's really not a whole bunch out there on the non-canonicals other than what you covered in your trilogy. And I don't know, I've always said that this one is like, you know, has a lot of the hallmarks of these Zodiac staples, the rope, the fire. Of course, he has the 22 long that he carries over up to Lake Herman Road. I mean, wherever you like to begin, I think really where you nailed it was Sheriff Webster predicting the sweetheart slayer or whatever it was. I know you brought up that quote multiple times, and then that precedes the Swindle murders. What really drove me crazy when I was doing my Lake Herman Road research for my episode 5 is Lundblad literally says San Diego reached out to me, and I just don't think this one is related at all. I'm like, I don't know why he wouldn't have. I know it's far away. I get that it's very far away from Vallejo, but I just wish he would have taken a closer look at it. What you laid out, you know, the MO seems much more similar.
Yeah, I agree. And I think San Diego understanding that possibly there's a relationship to Vallejo gives you some kind of insight into I want to say how rare this type of activity was. Now, you know, people are getting murdered a lot, and people make that argument, and it's, you know, definitely true. But this type of murder with this behavior was not as common as a lot of people would have you believe. And I think that whole, you know, the letter and the phone call and its timing kind of illustrate that point. Yeah, I think Sheriff Webster, he was he was the one person who, in my opinion, understood the killer from almost the very beginning.
Mhm.
You know, we have Gaviota, and it seems to be a motiveless crime, a motiveless murder, and Sheriff Webster, you know, I think picks up very quickly that likely the killer didn't know the people, and likely he's murdering them. Eventually, as you described, he calls them sweetheart slayers after San Diego, but he understands that it's potentially a sweetheart slayer very quickly. And
before the Swindle, which is
yeah. And it's a LA Times article that's published right after the Swindles, I think, where he explains that he had reached out to other law enforcement areas in Southern California, other, especially Oceanside areas, law enforcement communities, and explained that the killer from his area might likely reappear somewhere else. And so, of course, when the Swindles are murdered in San Diego, he's got detectives down in San Diego like a day and a half later with bullets in hand, you know, shell casings in hand. And like we mentioned earlier, the only reason though, you know, people can't say it's connected is because those casings don't match, because he used a different weapon. Right. And so Webster, you know, says, well, it doesn't mean it's not our guy. We just can't prove that it is our guy. But from that point forward, we get the whole Sandy character, and there's a lot of like red herrings. And that initial insight that he had kind of gets lost a little bit.
Sure.
No, it gets lost a lot. Let's say.
I agree.
But I believe his understanding and his insight are, you know, 100% accurate. And so we go up, you know, actually, so the way I put it in the books, I think, if you look at the timing here, right, we have June 63 followed by February of 64. That's, you know, what, 7 months. That's not, in the grand scheme of things, that's not that much time, to be honest.
Sure.
And in my opinion, this guy is smart. You know, we don't like to say serial killers are smart or you know, assign good attributes to evil people. But in my opinion, this guy's smart. And he's smart enough to know that he shouldn't be killing near where he lives. And so I believe from the very beginning, he is traveling. And he goes, I believe he lives somewhere in the greater LA area, and that he basically went north to Gaviota for his first crime and then south to San Diego for a second crime. And you know, he waited a while, and he went, whatever that is, like 250 miles away. And nevertheless, like a day later, Sheriff Webster says that's the same guy. Now, yeah, they never proved it, but it's pretty clear at that point, if he goes and kills another couple anywhere, honestly, Sheriff Webster is probably going to figure out what he's doing. So in my mind, that immediate identification is what motivates him to change his MO in terms of, you know, give up on attacking couples at the moment, move to women. And as I describe in my my books, I believe he has this sort of pathological hatred of women, and to a slightly lesser extent, the men who are able to have relationships with them. Actually, refine that a bit. Young, beautiful women, you know, the kind that he could never have a relationship with, and to a slightly lesser extent, the men who can have relationships with them. And that's why he's targeting the couples. And, you know, once once San Diego happens, he reevaluates and says, okay, let me just focus on the women, or a woman, a symbolic representative of young, beautiful women, who unfortunately happens to turn out to be Cheri Jo Bates. And he again moves, and this time moves inland. So yeah, in my mind, it's a very logical progression. And if that is what happened, it worked very well in that, neither Sheriff Webster nor anybody else suggested that Cheri Jo Bates' killing was related to the other two crimes until considerably later.
Yeah, it's interesting because, Domingos Edwards, Robert and Linda, they're on senior skip day. These people are high schoolers. Like, I just don't picture them having any real enemies, not to the level that something like that would happen to them, right? And even to the fact that they decide to go to that location at a whim. So that location is just really interesting. Of course, someone driving by on the highway obviously would have seen Bobby's car, so follow that down there. But I mean, the insinuation is that he's already down there because of the ammunition boxes in the hut, the shack, the George Gill shack. We could talk the whole Clyde and Gill thing, much like you referenced Sandy. So, they look at all the local suspects, people that, like, Bobby supposedly, like, broke up this fight at school, and just none of it really pans out. And then there's the whole scuffle on the beach thing, seemingly that Bobby fought back and injured the assailant. So that's why I really think Gaviota is the most interesting non-canonical, because, of course, there's the red herrings of Sandy you mentioned in your book, and the Vern Smith murder. But just the fact that there's all these little nuances where you don't really have any, the Swindles are kind of shot in the back looking at the beach. They're not really, like, looking for who's hiding behind them. It just seems like a more personal, but not in the way of that they knew each other. You know what I mean? Personal, that he kind of like what you said about him going back and burning the car when he doesn't get what he wants. He kind of like has this like overkill. And that's kind of what you see displayed on Bobby and Linda, dragging them back to the shack. I mean, so this is interesting. I thought that a lot more people would be on, Domingos and Edwards. Like you said, you thought more people would be on to Kathleen John. When I did the poll on my channel, it was literally 50-50, and you guys drive me crazy for that. But you know what I mean? It's just, it seems like a very polarizing one. Just because there's so much going on. They say Zodiac doesn't touch the bodies, and they got dragged back to the shack. So that's not enough for me to say, well, they got dragged 30 feet, and then later on the canonicals, he doesn't touch anybody. Like you said, that's just the evolving MO for me.
Right.
So, yeah, it's just interesting down there in Santa Barbara.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
So, in my opinion, right, we have, Gaviota, we have San Diego, Riverside. Then somewhere between 1966, 67, he moves up to San Francisco. And then he understands that essentially this is an opportunity to start anew. And from the whole Riverside ordeal, he understands that he likes writing and taking credit for these crimes, and it's a way to relive the crimes without actually committing, having to commit more crimes. It's a way to sort of amplify the payoff of the crimes. And he also understands, okay, if he's going to be writing and taking credit for crimes, that they're necessarily going to connect his crimes. Because, when he was in Southern California, in my opinion, his goal was to not have his crimes connected. But it's only when he decides to start writing that he realizes, okay, they're going to connect my crimes if I'm writing. And therefore, I need to have this persona that can be associated with the crimes. And, he has a long time, or he has time to think about it. You can argue whether it's long or not.
Sure.
And eventually comes up with the Zodiac.
Absolutely. We weren't discussing them at all. It's a topic I can't get away from. None of us can. You don't really mention too many suspects in your trilogy. We had a question for you in the chat. What's your opinion on ALA, Arthur Lee Allen?
I don't think it was Arthur Lee Allen at all. I mean, you know, fingerprints, handwriting, DNA. I know a lot of people quibble about all of it, but truthfully, there's a lot of legitimacy to all that. Plus, he was a child molester. I don't think that is the type of person that the Zodiac was. And, you know, to be honest, I never liked Arthur Lee Allen, like when I first became aware of the Zodiac, which is essentially 1999. So nowadays, there's a lot more reason to believe that it wasn't Arthur Lee Allen. And I don't like him anymore. And I probably like him less. I don't know. I know you know because you've read the books, but for your audience, I don't have a suspect. There's nobody that I think was the Zodiac. At times, I wish I did, but I don't. I try to remain objective, and when I look at it objectively, there's nobody that is of all the common suspects. I don't think he's any of them. I think, you know, if you look at the Golden State Killer, D'Angelo, he wasn't on anybody's radar, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly the same kind of situation with the Zodiac. He's somebody out there. He's not on anybody's radar. Unfortunately, we don't have a nuclear DNA profile to go find him. You know, if we ever do identify him, he'll just be somebody we've never heard of, in my opinion.
Totally agree. I raise all those Allen topics fairly frequently, and people still love to fight me on every single one. It's because law enforcement doesn't have the fingerprints. They don't have, DNA, that, so they just do whatever they can to keep the guy in play. But I think if there's one stone that's been turned, it's Arthur Lee Allen. You know what I mean? That's what I would say. I'd be very surprised if they found proof and came back to us and announced that the Zodiac was Allen. That would strike me as way up.
I think, I think there was a time when he didn't mind people thinking he was the Zodiac. Right. And that has created all kinds of trouble for a long time. And that last interview of his where he's like, I'm not the damn Zodiac. I think he's being honest there, but he's kind of, lying in the bed that he's made for himself at that point.
Yeah, you can't take it back once you open Pandora's box.
Yeah. And of course, Netflix creating documentaries about Arthur Lee Allen isn't really helping the subject go away. So
I was going to ask you about their claims of Riverside and bringing children with them to Tahiga's Beach. I mean, you guys have seen my episode 4. That's obviously not what I think happened, but Netflix had a little bit different version of events there, bringing the kids down there on a school day. It was obviously a Tuesday in Gaviota.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with that documentary. My opinion, somebody somewhere is lying. I don't know why.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is a good one. The sniper at Gaviota Beach. This is always why I didn't like Sandy. The supposed killer of Vern Smokey Smith is because there's that sniper already shooting at surfers down there with the rifle. So what I mean, like, why do we need this other kid who's, not even half the size of Bobby Domingos's leg to come down there and kill them with the 22? You know what I mean? It never made sense to me. But then there is a sniper. What's it? August at Berryessa before the Lake Berryessa attack. Doesn't mean that the two are related, but I just always thought that was interesting. You had a sniper at both waterfronts.
Yeah, I think that's probably just a coincidence. Sure. This case is full of coincidences, and in a case like this where we don't know the truth, and I kind of describe in the book how most cases, like, the more you learn, it kind of narrows down and converges on truth. But in this case, the more we learn, oftentimes it doesn't converge. And in fact, sometimes it calls into question things that we thought we knew. And so it just, diverges. So it's really a little bit frustrating. So you take that scenario and then you add all these kind of improbable coincidences on top of it, and it's just rife for,
Yeah, just a snowball effect.
Yeah, drawing conclusions that everybody's entitled to draw their own conclusions, but I just don't think those are related.
Yeah, no, I mean, I could see either way. Again, it's things that come up, because obviously we all look at the same resources, we find these same articles, and it just gets brought up in discussion. Of course, I want to talk about my infamous episode 1, the seaside slayings, the swindles of Ocean Beach. Mike kind of connected all the dots there with his theory and his trilogy. Same thing with these people. They've only been in San Diego for like essentially days. Like, I don't see them having enough time to live here to have some enemy that would do this to them, in February. We know like Johnny's a pretty quiet guy, kept to himself. However, they did take that walk frequently. So if somebody is watching them, stalking them, this is kind of like the perfect scenario for the Zodiac. So the Swindle one always interested me because of the 22 long.
So when you have stranger killers, people who murder strangers, we know that those are some very difficult crimes to solve, first of all. But the dynamics of the murders and the investigations have a lot to do with the particular strangers that you murder, let's say. And sort of at the extremes in the extended crimes of the Zodiac, as I call them, so including Southern California, we have Darlene Ferrin, who, was a bubbly, very easy to like waitress who encountered hundreds of people, encountered people all the time and knew all kinds of people, and therefore had, thousands and thousands of connections. And then at the other extreme, you have Joyce Swindle, who, as you say, showed up in San Diego, 5 days before the killing or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. Now, yeah, Johnny Ray, he had been there longer, but he was obviously deployed. But he had some connections to other people, but he was also a very quiet person. But, Joyce had no connections, really. She probably knew Johnny and the landlord, and that was probably about it. So, and because of that, and, Johnny Ray had limited connections also. He had more, but definitely limited. Mm-hmm. So as you're saying, yeah, there's just not a whole lot of opportunity for sort of nefarious connections. Yeah. And related to that, Darlene Ferrin, I think all of her connections have continuously muddied the water over the years in terms of what really happened. Could it have been this? Could it have been that? Because she had so many connections.
100%.
So yeah, it's both of those scenarios, both of those extremes are kind of bad in terms of investigations for different reasons. But yeah, they are, they create these dynamics to become part of the investigation.
Sure. One of them is too many avenues, and then the other one is not enough.
Exactly.
Discussing the trophy taking as well. So apparently Joyce's sister said her necklace disappeared. Of course, you have a kind of similar coup de grace headshot when the killer comes back down the bluff and kind of finishes them off. I've always likened that headshot similar to David Faraday and Paul Stine. One thing that you have in the book that I'm just gonna push back on. I would love this to pan out, but the Timex watch will go to. I'm gonna go to taking credit for Cheri Jo Bates, and we'll talk a little bit about the Cheri Jo Bates debacle because that's exactly what it is. I'm not convinced that that's Johnny Ray's watch. I would like that connection to be there because then I can point to my series and say, look, this is how Seaside Slayings connects to the Riverside activity, but I don't know. There's just not enough there for me. I understand that there's the paint chips on it, the paint droppings, but I feel like that could come from a lot of places. I mean, I understand it. It would make sense.
It could.
I'm not convinced.
But let me ask you this: how many watches have you seen with paint on them in your lifetime? Me, not many. Very few. And it's interesting, right? Because we find a watch at a crime scene in the extended crimes of the Zodiac. And there's only 2 other crimes before that crime. It's the 3rd crime in my list of extended crimes of the Zodiac. You know, I know we have the taxi cab driver in Oceanside, I guess it is, right? Maybe you could include that. But the point is that we have all these crimes, and we find a watch with paint on it. And at the immediately previous crime, we find out that the victim spent the last day of his life painting, and the killer took his watch. Now, maybe it's one of these coincidences that I was talking about. Maybe it is. I can't say it's not. But that is awfully interesting. I'll say that.
Sure, it's an interesting connection, and like I said, I unaware to myself became the non-canonical guy due to my video series. So if I could connect episode 1 to episode 3 in that way, I think it would certainly be interesting. And again, I'm not saying it's impossible, because like what Mike just laid out there makes a lot of sense. But I'm not so sure, because with the the skin material under Cheri's fingernails, it's clear that she fought back. So it just makes a lot more sense that the watch came off in the struggle than kind of just leaving the taunting trophy there. I mean, I'm open to either one. It just seems that to make more sense to me that it would have just came off in the struggle, and then if there's supposedly like the blood drips on the ground.
But they're not mutually exclusive, right? They could have struggled, and she could have gotten debris under her fingernails, and he could have left the watch also. But
sure, 100%. Or he's actually wearing the trophy watch, you know what I mean? And then it's kind of dual purpose in that sense. Assuming they had the same size wristband. But Mike does a great job, with laying out the Cheri Josephine Bates thing in the books, like he does with much of the rest of the narratives. But can we at least admit, Mike, that Cheri Jo Bates it's a house of cards, right? I don't see anything in the desk poem that is anything about Cheri or the Riverside activity crime. That's pretty much just a random
personally, I don't think the desk poem is written by the killer. I never have. It was found scrawled into a desk at RCC. Moral identified the handprinting as Zodiac's, but writing with an ink pen on a wood desk is not easy. You're kind of like forced to print anyway, and I think that may have had a lot to do with how it ended up looking similar, at least to whomever. But I've never been convinced that poem had anything to do with Cheri's death.
Yeah, I mean, we're together on that for sure.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that points to the killer, to the Zodiac. And I think, as I had talked to you about, the 3 6-month anniversary notes that were written, I think those are legitimately written by the killer. And I don't know what Riverside's goal is, other than the fact that they want to convince the world that the Zodiac was not responsible for Cheri Jo Bates's murder. We already know that they've lied to the public in the past, if you believe Tom Voight, in terms of what they told him about the number of stab wounds, etc.
Yeah,
I believe him. So I don't know what's going on with Riverside. I don't believe it. what they've said about those notes. And, in the book, I describe them as 3 perspective adjusted notes. Because, when whoever wrote them wrote to Cheri's father, she said she had to die instead of Bates had to die. Of course, because, it's his father, she is more personal probably, and also Bates, same last name as he has, so it kind of makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But, the Zodiac starts his letter writing campaign by writing 3 perspective adjusted letters. And this happens, that's what, April of 64 into July of 60, or no, I'm sorry, April of 67 to July of 69, a little over 2 years later. And, call it 500 miles apart. So again, in that one section of the book that kind of got removed because the editor asked to remove it, I don't know of anybody else writing 3 perspective adjusted notes or letters or what have you. And here we have somebody doing it within a little over 2 years, 500 miles apart. And let's just be honest, the guy said it was him. He took credit for Cheri Jo Bates. They stumbled upon my Riverside activity, but there's a hell of a lot more down there. Some people argue, oh, he could be talking about something. Come on. I don't see how that can be anything else. That's very clear. It's not explicit, but it's clear. So, I try to make this argument in the book, what you have to believe that all of this Southern California is not related to the Zodiac. And I really, for those, well, that's part of it. And then, of course, we have Scream, Squirm, and Twitch, with Twitch being misspelled. They appear like in the Zodiac writing within, Zodiac writing, I think it's like 5 words. And then in the confession, it's within 17 words or something like that. And they're in reversed order. But as I describe in the book, what you can see going on here is that we have somebody that has this psychological disposition where they derive pleasure not only out of killing people, but out of enjoying these infliction of physical and psychological pain on people. And, in the case of the Zodiac's letter, he's describing what he's going to do to his slaves in his afterlife. And in the case of the confession, he's describing what he did to Cheri Jo Bates. But in many ways, it's the same. So you have, in my opinion, you have the same person describing the same psychological phenomenon, falling back on the same vocabulary. That's why you have those 3 words. Now, I know people talk about whatever that article was, the Detective Magazine article.
True Detective or whatever.
Yeah. But I went back and looked at that a little bit more closely. And it really has the potential to be kind of ironic, right? Because this connection would be really strong if they didn't write that article. If they didn't sort of document this case to the world, right? But even if you look at that article, it's got sort of a blurry representation of the confession, a blurry picture of the confession, and then they document it in the article. They quote it in the article. Now, the quote, as I recall, the lines that have scream, squitch, and squirm are actually broken up over 2 paragraphs. So it ends in 1 paragraph and then starts on the next paragraph. And on top of that, what did the editors do? Well, the editors did what editors do. They corrected the spelling of Twitch. So So you have to be convinced that they went and explicitly extracted it from, sort of the blurry article. Maybe, sure, but the more logical conclusion, in my opinion, is that it's there because it's the same person. And there, in my opinion, and I go through it all in volume 3, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to connect Cheri Jo Bates to the Zodiac, based on the confession.
Yeah, I like the confession. I think the confession letter is the strongest, and I could, if I'm going the route of the taking credit theory, I could see, maybe Zodiac doing the confession. The problem is, it just, it seems like it's a smaller guy, at the Cheri event. It's a much smaller blade. I don't know if you saw Kenneth Main's thing on Cheri. He did the whole History Channel show, but he did it on his YouTube channel as well. He said that the shoe prints were linked back to Cleophas Martin, the groundskeeper. That was the first time that ever came up. So I don't know if that's actually been verified, because, the military style heel print, people make a big deal about it. But I mean, the watch band, if the guy is wearing it, it seems like, it doesn't really seem like this big, husky, stocky. The word stocky gets used a million times in Zodiac 1. Guy that we have later on in the canonicals. I mean, none of that can really be verified. So I'm just
stocky was also used to describe the one person that was unaccounted for in the reenactment of Cheri Jo Bates's murder.
Yeah, right? the heavy bearded man. Yeah, that could
heavy set. I'm sorry, you're right. Heavy set.
Yeah, it's just like, it just seems like, the poem is out. Everybody knows I'm not the biggest like RPD proponent. Like, I think Bob Barnett, I think there's just a whole list of things that went wrong. We could go count them all off. But I'm just kind of going with the announcement. Okay, that's the announcement. They're saying on the Bates had to die letters. So I'm just gonna kind of go with that, because that's the announcement they made. I'm no expert. I tell my audience all the time I'm not an expert. But I would really like some clarification on that announcement. As far as the way, Mike lays it all out, he does an amazing job with the narrative. It's just like, I just have a hard time with certain things, with certain details with the Riverside activity. Doesn't mean it's totally out. Obviously, we have the confession. Obviously, the comparison between the articles. I know Grinnell has done a lot of work with the linguistics, the way you just lined it up there with the twitch and squirm, choked, and things of that nature. But it seems way too sloppy for Zodiac. Of course, you could be learning from non-canonicals, as you said, and then evolving his MO later on in the in the canonicals. But yeah, it's a real rabbit hole with Cheri Jo Bates. And I don't really, as you said, there's so many steps where, moral saying, oh yeah, it's all definitely the same guy and stuff like that. I tend to just think he got that wrong. But it's definitely interesting. I mean, there's definitely a lot there. I would have probably expected him to say a little bit more than, I see you stumbled across my Riverside activity. But as you said, at that point, he's obviously established the canonicals. So he doesn't really need to go dig up ancient history when he's creating this Zodiac moniker. What do you make of the stylized Z symbol as the sign-off?
I don't really make much of anything of it. I don't know what it is. And is it a precursor to Zodiac? I don't know. Maybe. It meant something to whoever wrote it, but I don't know what.
Sure.
But so there'd been no unsolved murders at the time this happened in Riverside. And the confession is written, and in the confession, the killer writes, she wasn't the first, she won't be the last. So what happened to that killer? Where did he go? Why is it the Zodiac takes credit for crimes that end up being unsolved? And why, as I talk about, there was what let's see here. There were the two girls that were killed in San Jose, right?
Was it the
And
Snoozy Furlong?
yeah, and the press all but sort of assigned them to the Zodiac, but he never took credit for them, really. I know other people have argued, but he never explicitly
his kill count to like insinuate that
he inflated his kill count, but what that means, who knows, right?
Sure.
And when he wrote, let's see, when he wrote the dates on Lake Berryessa, he was very clear about what crimes he was taking credit for. That was pointed out by the detective that was sort of investigating that, and it makes a lot of sense. But the point is, the press all but gave him credit for those crimes at different points or at some point. He could have easily taken credit for that if he wanted to. You know, he could have said, I give the cops credit for stumbling across my San Jose activity, right?
100%.
But he didn't do that. And then that crime is later solved. So, you know, all these ones that, and I make a similar case with Charles Jarman, the taxi driver. There were initial, you know, that one was solved pretty fast. So you could even say he didn't have enough time to take credit for it. Mm-hmm. But, you know, in the beginning, that again was sort of attributed to the Zodiac. And in fact, Yellow Cab put out a reward because they thought the Zodiac was targeting their taxi drivers. But he didn't take credit for that. But yes, he does take credit for certain crimes. He's vague. He's vague, but in my mind, clear about what he's taking credit for. And certainly Cheri Jo Bates was one of them, and it's continued to be unsolved. So, you know, and her killer seems to be someone who's obsessed with killing women, who claims to have killed before and claims he will kill again. But who else did he kill? I think there's a much stronger case to be made that this is the person who evolved into the Zodiac than was some other person who just, I don't know what, disappeared into the woodwork. And of course, like what Keith Jesperson at one point, you know, he was a trucker killer, right? Happy face killer. Somebody took credit for one of his crimes, and he also wrote letters to newspapers. What did he do about it? He wrote about it. So, you know, with the Zodiac taking credit for Cheri Jo Bates is the real, what happened to the real killer? He's just not going to care. He's just all the better, so much the better. And I don't know, you know, the kind of person that writes the confession doesn't just fade away and you never hear from them again. But you know, evolving into a different persona that also commits crimes and writes letters, that's very much like what somebody who would write the confession does, in my opinion. So again, in my opinion, this whole Southern California, it's an evolution. He's learning, he's evolving, he's becoming a different person, such that when he finally moves to San Francisco, he's starting again. I want to say better, but that's not the right word, right? He more in line with what he wants in terms of his goals. Yeah. But having learned from everything that he's done.
Yeah.
You know, the one thing that's maybe interesting with Cheri Jo Bates is I've always wondered if the University of Texas tower killer, Charles Whitman, happened a little bit before Cheri Jo Bates. And he had written, people describe it as a suicide note, right? Or a letter where he explained all kinds of things about his situation. And it was partially typed, and then I think the rest was handwritten. I always wondered if maybe that had been part of the motivation for the killer to start writing and actually write the confession. Because in my mind, he likely, he clearly read the newspaper. He liked reading the newspaper. And he clearly, I would bet money, he read articles about that. And he probably saw the impact that the writing could have. And that may well have motivated him to write the confession. And one other thing while we're on the topic, later on when the Zodiac writes to the Los Angeles Times, he says, I'm writing to the LA Times because they don't bury me on the back pages like some of the other newspapers. Well, question, how does he know? And what is he talking about? Is he talking about the Zodiac? Because it's very unlikely he's reading the LA Times on a regular basis. And it's actually very unlikely he's reading Zodiac-related articles in the LA Times. But what is likely is that he was reading the LA Times in the time frame of Gaviota and San Diego and Riverside. And as I recall, Gaviota, one of them had one front page story. I think let me think here. I think Gaviota was 2 front page stories and San Diego was 1 front page story, or vice versa. And then Cheri Jo Bates, I think, was on page 2 or 3. So if he had lived through that, he would have known that the LA Times gave him front page coverage. Unrelated to the Zodiac coverage. Just another one of those data points.
No, I like that a lot. I've never thought of it in that context, that it's kind of this random reference, but he's actually referring to something specific. And that makes a lot of sense. I guess I'm kind of at odds with myself because I've lowered on Cheri, but I still think there's a hell of a lot more down there refers to Domingos Edwards and the Swindles. So obviously I can't have it both ways. So I mean, I need to, figure that out.
You could.
But if he's just writing the letter and then maybe not actually doing it. But again, let's talk about what, as Mike said, if confession letter, right? And then this guy just disappears into thin air because there's no actual like Riverside letter killer, after 66, which is what you'd expect rather than Zodiac popping up in the Bay Area. But yet RPD is still stuck on thinking that it's a local suspect that knew Cheri. You know what I mean? So how does that, why the confession letter then, right? Like this local guy that knew Cheri wrote that confession letter for no reason. That doesn't really make any sense. So definitely interesting.
I always felt like the sabotage that was done on Cheri's vehicle is a sabotage that is targeting a stranger. If somebody knew Cheri, they likely would have had other ways to entrap her.
Sure.
But, sabotaging a car and then being a good Samaritan, as I mentioned earlier, that is one way in which, back then, even now, a woman would let down her guard and be willing to accept help from a stranger. So
because you need the approach, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So I think, there's a lot of circumstantial aspects to this crime and those other crimes that in my mind make it very likely that the killer was the same man who would later become the Zodiac. And that's just another data point.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that fact there. And that's one thing I do agree with Kenneth Maines on, because he said, like, the scorned lover theory, like some guy that's mad at her because she's going to marry the new boyfriend, the new fiance, is going to be able to like approach her and keep his cool. Like that's not going to happen. He's obviously going to blow up on her, start yelling, and yet no one reports any sort of argument outside the VW. But yeah, she's out there arguing with some guy. Okay, that you could see. But the fact that she just goes off, there's all this missing time. And like you said, if you know her, you don't need the ruse. You could say, hey, I'll meet you at the library. You forgot this. If her window was open or whatever, you take one of the syllabus, the bibliography, or one of the books. Hey, you dropped this book. You could do something a lot more personal than like, yeah, I pulled out your distributor coil and I got to help you fix your car now. that just doesn't track, in my opinion. I totally agree.
Yep.
Just catching up with the chat there. They're kind of going off. So let's move on to Richard Radetich. I had seen the name floated in Zodiac research, really didn't know much about it. Your book gave me a lot more of the details. I shot a man with a 38. I still think is a weird way to word it, but okay, that's a man in a car with a 38. It's a weird way to word it, but that's Zodiac, as you said.
It's ambiguous, right? Yeah. Did you shoot him with a 38, or did he have a 38?
Yeah, exactly. Typical Zodiac, not getting to the point. Although when he does raise, like, it's more, I forget the exact phraseology. If anybody remembers, throw it in the chat. It's more honorable to kill a pig because they have like a firearm or whatever. Like that just kind of seemed like Zodiac blowing smoke, because it's like, other than Richard Radetich, you really don't have any other scenario. I know you raised the Park Street bombing in the book, and I thought that was a great chapter. Let me see if I can get all the way back to where they were talking about Radetich. Somebody asked me, do I think he killed the cop? And I said, let's ask Mike. But if you want to just start summarizing Radetich for the audience, and I'll come in once I find the comment.
Yeah. Right. Richard Radetich was gunned down in the early morning hours of, I think it was a Friday morning. He was actually writing a ticket on a car, and someone came up and just shot him. And he held on. He was taken to the hospital and held on and died like 12 hours later or something like that. But the thing is, and then as you say, the Zodiac wrote very ambiguously, very shortly thereafter, that he was talking about his bus bomb. He said his school's out. Again, it was June, and he's like, well, I punished the people of San Francisco in a different way. I shot a man sitting in a parked car with a 38. He didn't explicitly say it was Radetich, didn't explicitly say it was a cop. But, and early on, there used to be arguments made because of the way Robert Graysmith worded something in his book, that it wasn't possible for the killer to have done it. And that ended up being completely wrong. And yeah, originally the cops had somebody that they thought had done it, but eventually they weren't able to charge him because he likely didn't do it. And he went back to Ohio. I'm from Ohio, actually, originally, and wasn't around when the whole investigation was happening. And he mentioned the first time I learned about it is when I saw my face on a wanted poster. And given, everything else and the context, that's, in my opinion, that's likely a true statement. He was later convicted for everything else he was wanted for, but not for the murder of Radetich. So again, this is sort of, in my opinion, the Zodiac goes through some phases. In the first phase, he's really concerned with his identity and establishing his identity. This is where he's giving excessive detail about the crimes, and he's trying to convince law enforcement of something that should be obvious. And of course, law enforcement is somewhat playing a game with him. Maybe you are the Zodiac, maybe you are, or maybe you are this killer, maybe you're not, which eventually leads him to get the bloodstained piece of Paul Stine's shirt. And at that point, he has at least the ability to irrefutably prove that he is the killer of Paul Stine, at least. And you sort of see him evolve into a different phase at that point. He's not so much concerned with proving that he is who he is. That seems to be sort of a given at that point. And within this new phase of activity, he's concerned with sort of creating all this uncertainty. And, and this is when he is no longer providing excessive detail, but he's being very vague. And, this example with Richard Radetich is sort of the height of vagueness, right? I shot a man sitting in a car with a .38. Was it this police officer who was shot, or was it not? And if you go back to my solstices and equinoxes, in all honesty, in the beginning, I used to be on the fence. I always, like I mentioned, I thought that ambiguity of that statement was very interesting, but I didn't know what to make of it. But then when I realized that this crime was right at the summer solstice, that really pushed me over the edge with this. I very likely was the killer, I believe. Now, the other thing, though, is that it's a bit of an oddity because when he was murdered, it was a huge deal. I read one digital book that had a picture of his funeral with all of the people from SFPD. It was really amazing. And at the time, as I recall, the mayor of San Francisco was like overseas. He cut his trip short. He came back. And I believe Richard Radetich was given the honor of, being in the rotunda and people coming and visit him. It was a big deal. And because of that, it almost was too great of a morbid accomplishment for, in my opinion, the Zodiac. They don't want to say that this deranged killer killed him because it's like giving him too much credit. We already know he wants credit for doing this kind of stuff.
Higher accolade for Zodiac.
Yeah, it's just too much. And because of that, I feel like there's this real sense of we don't even want to consider the possibility that the Zodiac did this. But, again, his murder remains unsolved to this day. And for those various reasons, I believe that it really was the Zodiac who killed him.
Yeah, I'm big into the solstice theory. My birthday is the summer solstice. So the way you laid out that Radetich chapter, it definitely moved my needle on him as well. Not having known much about it, just other than Zodiac made this kind of could go either way type of phrase, and then whatever little articles have popped up here and there. But I really like the way that you wrapped that one up. If we could move on to the American Practical Navigator, you spent some time on that in the trilogy, and I think it made a lot of sense the way that you laid it out.
Yeah. So, one thing that Robert Graysmith gets wrong that irritates me to no end is that he calls the killer Zodiac. And of course, because the movie is based on the book, they call the movie Zodiac. And they refer to the killer as Zodiac time and time and time again. But if you look at how he's referring to himself, he's referring to himself as the Zodiac. Definite article. It's important. It matters. And of course, the natural inclination is to assume that it has something to do with astrology. But if you look at the Phillips 66 map, you look at the symbol that he drew on the Phillips 66 map, the key to understanding it is being exposed to what it's derived from, which is a compass rose. And I didn't fully understand this until I had an appointment with my son in his pediatrician's office, and that pediatrician had a nautical theme in his office. So he had nautical charts on the wall. And I went, I was looking around, I looked at a nautical chart and saw the compass rose. Typical nautical chart has like 2, 3, or 4 compass roses on it. And these are standard figures that are used to orient true north and magnetic north. And they have sort of one circle within another circle. And the magnetic north, of course, is the direction north based on the Earth's magnetic fields. And it's slightly different than true north. So there are 2 circles. One points at the true north, and the other one is rotated to point to magnetic north. And then they're graduated into 360 degrees. And then they obviously have sort of subdivisions at 30 degrees and 45 degrees, and etc. So once I saw that compass rose on the nautical chart, I'm like, clearly this is what that symbol is derived from. He drew his symbol, which essentially has sort of a zodiac symbol, and it's got an arrow on top, just like a compass rose. And then the top is labeled 0, and there's 3, 6, and 9 in sort of the cardinal directions. And with the instruction 0 is to be set to magnetic north. So, there's, after having, seen the compass rose, there's very little question that it's derived from a compass rose. So that sent me down into the space of, let's go find out more about nautical navigation. And very shortly after that, I've ended up at the American Practical Navigator, also known as Bowditch, often in tribute to its original author, Nathaniel Bowditch. This is sort of a compendium of nautical information that has been published continuously for, I think, more than 200 years, originally by Nathaniel Bowditch, and then at some point the United States Navy bought the copyright to it and started publishing it periodically. So, I went and bought the 1966 version, so the one sort of just before the Zodiac came into existence, and started looking through it. And yes, it sort of has this whole section on what it calls celestial navigation, which is navigation by the nighttime sky. And in that section, apart from having a lot of compass roses, or apart from the book having compass roses, let's say, that section defines the zodiac, quote unquote. And it also explains the relationship of the zodiac to the solstices and the equinoxes, and defines the solstices and the equinoxes, and provides a lot of good information. And that particular version, they've since changed it. That particular version has a sentence, something along the lines of, the pseudoscience of astrology assigns additional meaning to, the signs of the zodiac that's not recognized by scientific minds, or something like that. So this is what leads me to believe that the zodiac is related to the zodiac of or the division of the nighttime sky into these 12 slices, 30-degree slices. That is scientific. It's measurable. It's it's defined very precisely. That is something that's different than astrology. And really, there is nothing that I am aware of that convincingly suggests that the zodiac had anything to do with astrology. But he drew that compass rose symbol on the Phillips 66 map. That very clearly links him to the subject of celestial navigation and nautical navigation. So, and you know, from the very beginning, there's been this problem. I reference an article in I think volume 1, where it talks about, you know, detectives from San Francisco meeting with an expert on astrology to understand the killer. But that, you know, that problem has plagued the Zodiac, in the case of the Zodiac, for the last, you know, 50 plus years, honestly, in my opinion. So I think that's pretty much it, unless you have any specific questions about it.
No, I thought you absolutely nailed that topic. That chapter or topic rather, because I guess it came up multiple times on the American Practical Navigator. It was super interesting. I really like what you said about astrology versus scientific astronomy in terms of the Zodiac moniker and Zodiac getting that satisfaction that people would misconstrue one for the other and not have the actual scientific understanding. I mean, I've always kind of like leaned that way, but you just describe the celestial navigation in a way that I was just never able to articulate. So
it's really kind of funny because I feel like there's very few concepts in popular culture that are so widely used, but then have this sort of two different levels of meaning. And there's not much understanding about the different levels. So, you know, most of us, and especially in the 60s, it was even more so, right? Most of us know about the Zodiac from astrology. That's where we know about it. But we don't really understand that there is the Zodiac, which is the sort of division of the nighttime sky, and then there's astrology on top of the Zodiac. I gave a presentation at the Vallejo Naval Museum a few years back. And in that presentation, I likened it to swimming pools and diving boards. You know, you never really see a diving board without a swimming pool, right? But you can have pools without diving boards. But if we existed in a world where we always saw pools and diving boards together, we would think they just always go together. But you can have a pool without a diving board. And that's kind of the relationship between the Zodiac and astrology, right? Everybody knows astrology or the diving board, but they don't understand that it's completely separate from the swimming pool itself. And just because they always appear together doesn't mean that the swimming pool requires a diving board. It's kind of a strange analogy, but for some reason I liked it.
No, that's an amazing metaphor. I like it a lot. I mean, just what you did with the whole celestial navigation, I thought you hammered it home. And going along with the celestial navigation, so you know, people have liked to shoot down I use that loosely, merchant marine theory, because I think it's later on in volume 3 you bring up on, you know, Zodiac not being worried about his fingerprints being in, you know, APHIS or any other database, or at least, you know, being tracked down that way. You go into the whole, like, you know, obviously if he's a military serviceman, he's going to have this whole profile with prints and such. I think the merchant marine, and I know Dion Walker's in the chat, he tends to agree with me here, that it can answer a lot of those celestial navigation questions and nautical travel, and maybe some of these other, you know, seemingly Navy references that Zodiac makes. But it can also even provide, you know, why there's kind of these gaps between the canonicals and the non-canonicals. Is he out there at sea? And it just seems like so many people think to double down that he's this like Navy expert pilot, expert sailor. And I just don't know that we see that anywhere in the Zodiac crimes. Like, definitely not in his shooting, you know, which is something I bring up often. So I just always wonder, could he have some other kind of nautical profession, you know, outside of the military? That's kind of where I kind of go with it.
I mean, it's certainly possible. I always thought that he was kind of more of a wannabe, in that he likely I mean, I don't know exactly what things were like at, back in the 60s at that point, but when I was growing up, he probably would have been kind of guy that goes to gun shows and gets, paramilitary documentation and reads through it and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, we don't really know. So, anything that can explain his nautical knowledge is possibly correct. There was some reason that he knew about this stuff. I always thought maybe he had a family member that was in the Navy or maybe the Merchant Marines, or it's possible he could have been in the Merchant Marines himself. Who knows? We just don't know.
Yeah, I kind of always say, people bring up the wing walkers, and it just seems like a lot of that stuff you could just get secondhand. Any civilian can walk into an Army, Navy and get that stuff. So I don't really see the wing walkers as a smoking gun military data point, as you say, the way a lot of people just like wing walkers. I'm good. He was Army, Navy. He was Navy or Air Force. And I'm like, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, right? You know what I mean? Because a lot of these things were now the whole Vandenberg PX of the ammunition for Gaviota, that's interesting. But again, as you said, you could have a family member, like family members have access to PXs. That's something that, people need to understand. So it's not like you need a service ID to get in there,
It's interesting because that was, in my opinion, a very good piece of police work. Them hunting that down and figuring that out, right? They decided based on the lot number on the boxes that it was possible. There were only 2 stores that sold it. One was the PX of Vandenberg, and a sporting goods store. And for detailed reasons, they thought it came from the PX possibly. But the premise of that the premise of that approach, I believe, is invalid because I don't think he was local. See, I think he traveled to that location. And once you accept that, then all bets are off because he likely didn't buy it in that area.
Right. 100%. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. It's just interesting. I mean, some of the newcomers to the case, they hear, military style crew cut, wing walker footprints at Lake Berryessa, and then they just inundate us with all these like Navy and Air Force and all these suspects. There's one of the newer ones out there now is LD Hill, and he's just like absolutely horrible suspect. He spent most of his life in Ohio and his service in Texas. And so now we're just getting people because they have a military career. They're like not even really, focused in the Bay Area. And it's like, that's just a non-starter. You have to at least put the guy up here to mail the letters and just do all these, different things that we've outlined. So that's just the state of the case at this current juncture.
Yeah.
I think we've kept Mr. Cole hostage long enough here. I still have a bunch of stuff, obviously, because you have a trilogy of books here. So I say we maybe get you back for volume 2 sometime when your schedule allows for it.
That sounds good. It took me 15 years to write the 3 volumes. So yeah.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not surprised. We can talk about it for a long time, basically.
I've been talking about getting you on forever. I guess a lot of the audience maybe was ahead of me on your work, and because of your mention of the non-canonicals and obviously my video series. And I'm like, we're gonna get Cole on. Don't worry. I just had to lock in and read all 3. So volume 3, volume 1, 2, and 3. Go get those on Amazon. Give Mike a review once you complete them. They're excellent. I can't say enough good things about them. Let's get your website plugged, Mike. ZodiacRevisited.com and Zodiac Revisited on YouTube. Any other final thoughts for us?
Yeah, we've been losing a lot of people in the Zodiac community recently, and Michael Kelleher passed away earlier this year, and Howard Davis before that, I believe, or sometime around there. And it's just really sort of sad. William Bill Baker also, I think we've lost recently. So I don't know. It's this case takes a lot and it gives very little. And you
Well
know,
said.
for those of us that have, everybody will experience this eventually, like unhappily, unless this case gets solved, and I hope that it does. But you know, it's just really sad that all these people that we knew that have contributed great things to the case, we're losing them. So I just wanted to mention them because they had all three of them had made major contributions to the case, and certainly my research benefited immensely from their contributions, and I certainly appreciated all of their work. So just wanted to say it's sad that we're losing them, and yeah, I'll miss them. Let's say that.
100%, very true. Howard Davis, one of my early mentors in the community, helped me out with a bunch of documents on episode 1, and I was talking to him all the time. I was always defending him because people would just, have a tendency of saying, I don't like Howard suspect, therefore nothing he ever did was good. I'm like, Howard went down there, interviewed primaries in Riverside. I mean, you can't say that he wasn't boots on the ground in the investigation, because he absolutely was.
And one of the great things about Howard is that he had a suspect, and he pushed the suspect, and I don't think his suspect was the Zodiac, but he didn't mind people not thinking his suspect was the Zodiac. And he would have been happy to have been proven wrong if it meant solving the case. Right. So, and there are a lot of people in the Zodiac community, I'm be honest, that are not like that. Right.
Sure.
So
Sure.
yeah, he certainly had sort of a controversial take on the Zodiac himself, but he did a tremendous amount of very good research. That interview with Kathleen Johns is an incredibly valuable asset to our community, I think. And Swindles, basically got the information that I had because of him. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, he helped us both out. And man, yeah, he'll definitely be missed. Mike's books benefited from Howard. My video series benefited from him, so he'll definitely be missed as well. Bill Baker. I tried so hard to get in touch with him, but I think he was having some health issues at the end there, so didn't really get that one going. But one last thing on Riverside just popped into my mind randomly. The confession mentions the phone call at the end, like that was me with the phone call. I wish that Chief Kincaid could have verified the phone call, because then we would have had one more phone call in the mix, along with Blue Rock Springs and Napa Sheriff's Department.
Well, I mean, one of the articles did mention the police saying that they did get crank calls, what they consider to be crank calls, which in retrospect, I'm guessing were not crank calls. But yeah, it's very vague and not very substantial reference to it.
If there's one thing that we could get Cole on, I wish we could get Ray Davis. You mentioned the Oceanside cabbie. I wish we could get him higher up on your list, just because you got the phone call after, you got the phone call before. I know that's one where we're at odds, but I always thought that was the spitting image of the Paul Stine up there. That's my full circle theory. Take it or leave it, but maybe someday you'll look into it a little bit more.
Yeah, I have the killer as more of a sweetheart slayer in that time frame, so
sure,
I don't think it fits. And in my mind, the killer evolves into Paul Stine up in San Francisco.
Sure.
Cheri Jo Bates is just a modification of his sort of pathology, but when he gets to Paul Stine, he is truly changing, because the terror of the excitement and perverse value he gets from the terrorism aspect of what he's doing becomes as important as sort of his hatred of women and the guys who can have relationships with them, in my mind. So I hear you, and I think most people. I think people who are aware of my work are always a little surprised when I'm not sort of very keen on the ocean side, or what is it, Davis? But yeah, I gotta call it like I see it, and that's how I see it.
No worries. Well, I mean, you laid out, your theory amazingly in the trilogy. Everybody go check those out. And I know you've been doing some stuff with Ned over on Black Box, so go check out Ned's new episode with Druser. Yeah, like I said, you wrote a trilogy. I still got plenty more for you. Let's get you back next time when your schedule permits.
All right, sounds great. Thanks a lot, Ross. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. This was excellent. Really appreciate your time, Mike.
Yep.
I'll take us out. I'll drop you out, and I'll take us out with the audience and do the plugs for the book.
Sounds good. Thanks again, Ross.
Thank you, sir. Have a good night. Appreciate you. All right, guys. That is, let's see if I can get my background back on. That is author Michael Cole, author of the Zodiac Revisited Volume 1, 2, and 3. Go ahead and check those out at zodiacrevisited.com. And check out Mike's channel, Zodiac Revisited. He's got the Most Dangerous Game uploaded on there. You guys know I used to have it on my bookshelf. We'll work on getting that back up there. Yeah, definitely would like to get him back so we can talk Charlie Chan at Treasure Island, Most Dangerous Game, and some of the Zodiac movie references. That would be a cool conversation. Appreciate everybody who came through. Shout out to Holly, Dion, Druser. Shout out to Pixie helping us out as always with the links and moderating the chat. Any other final questions for me before I go? Yeah, we'll try to get the debates going for you guys and maybe get somebody else up for the inner series when the time. Yeah, no, I know you guys love the debates. When the time calls for it, but in the meantime, Zodiac Files episode 5, the Lake Herman Road ambush, will be coming soon. And soon after that, the Blue Rock Springs attack. As you guys know, I'm fresh off the trip from Vallejo, and we're working on the edits. You know how the editing process goes. Longer than we would all like, but yeah, this one was a long time coming. If you like my episodes 1 through 4 covering the Swindles, Gaviota Beach murders, and Cheri Jo Bates mystery, I highly recommend Mike's books. He goes into the most detail that I've seen on the non-canonicals. So definitely a great compliment to the video series. Make sure you check that out. Appreciate you, D. You're the man. Be talking to you guys behind the scenes. And it seems like everybody is kind of winding down in the chat. So if there's no other questions or comments for me, I will see you guys off. ZodiacRevisited.com. Like, sub, share. Oh, yeah. Appreciate you, Kathy. Those will be coming as soon as humanly possible once we get on the edits. We're making some good progress on episode 5 on Lake Herman Road. So like, sub, share. Click the join button for a membership. And you can head over onto my Patreon where I do some of the Most Dangerous Game stuff, the movie adaptations and such. So that'll be it for me, folks. That was an amazing interview. We'll be talking to you guys next time on the next one. Like, sub, share, click join for a membership. Head on to the Patreon. You can subscribe free with a Gmail. And if you want to get any donations in to get your name in the credits of episodes 5 and 6, you can email me, message me wherever you can find me. Appreciate everybody coming through. Thank you, guys. And once again, there's the Patreon. Thank you, Fire Pixie. We are out. Like, sub, share. Zodiac Files, episode 19, author Mike Cole. Amazing interview. Yeah, there's just a lot of content in that trilogy, guys. So I suggest you guys read it for yourself.